So re-traumatization is someone having another traumatic experience which is related to their earlier traumatic experience. So it's creating a scenario in their body brain where the same sorts of things have been triggered off for them from an earlier experience. It could be as simple as, you know, coming into, I hate to use the example of Centrelink, but coming into somewhere like Centrelink and finding it, maybe coming up against somebody and finding it a very authoritarian experience could trigger an earlier experience of authority being misused or abused, which could be a triggering or re-traumatizing experience. It can be on that level, it can be on a much larger systemic level.
And because the triggers can be so various, we can't possibly know what will trigger individuals. It just underlines again the importance of trauma-informed principles, of the safety, putting people at their ease. To reduce the likelihood of a trigger and better management of it if it comes up.
But also just to think about the possibility that the person that you're supporting has a trauma history and therefore has the potential to be triggered by a whole range of scenarios that you may not be able to identify, but to understand that if they then react in a certain way with behaviour that appears challenging, that they have their own good reason within their own past experience and within their body and system response to have that response and to be reactive.
I think that's a critical point, because with adult survivors, often the source of the original trauma is way back when. It's certainly not apparent in the here and now to people around them. So the triggering can elicit behaviour or response that seems quite strange, weird, out of context, but absolutely makes sense, as Kathy said, in the context of what may have occurred a long time ago.
Yeah, and it can be strange for the person. They don't know why they're having that reaction or response, you know, so it's not about trying to remove all the triggers, but it's about being able to see the person where they are and meet them in that place.
And it's impossible to remove all the triggers, isn't it? Because they could be so random. And I think the difference, like Pam was pointing out the difference before between single incident and complex trauma, a single incident trigger could be, if one had had a car accident, the sound of screeching brakes, which is a lot easier to determine that as a trigger. But with complex trauma, it's often a lot of associative experiences that have compounded into a re-traumatizing experience.
Everyone's heard with the single incident of the helicopters, with Vietnam vets, with the car backfiring with a big shock. But as you say, the triggers for childhood trauma are much more varied and diffuse and hard to detect.
But if someone has grown up in a childhood of fear, then there are many things that can throw them back into that frightened space and a normal physiological response of fight or flight. So just imagine someone who has been scheduled and the police car arrives to take them to the mental health unit. They're manhandled into the police van, and so they will immediately go into a fight response. Whereas if the police officer sits down, explains to them what's happening, helps them to calm their nervous system, they'll probably walk in an understanding way into the van.
This is a critical point.
To go to hospital.
The response of the first responders, because by definition, if they've been called, it's regarded as an emergency, very high urgency situation. But it's absolutely critical that that person who is at their highest need often is met with that kind of trauma-informed response. It's really important we all understand that for systemic change.
It's good to be aware that the system, therefore, because of the trauma, is wired for danger. Rather than wired for safety. So they're looking for threats, they're looking for threats in the environment and in interpersonal relationships. So being able to calm that system first and then allow them to ground themselves is critical.
And what we've often seen in systems is that situations become escalated because systems have often been risk averse and so they're trying to control and coerce to get a response. But
and just listen to those two words.
Yeah,
control
exactly.
And coerce.
But what's been found is if you work with people and if people understand and you communicate like we all like to be communicated with, then we can really change the outcome. And certainly where that's happened, the need for coercion and restraint has decreased dramatically.
I think one of the most challenging things is the research that does exist about the re-traumatisation that has occurred, unfortunately, within mental health settings, within the very service settings that people have presented to or been required to go to for help. So it's not about blaming individuals, it's about systems that have been organised around, as Kathy said, these immediate responses, often around restraint. so important that the whole
We're-
system is.
I think we're learning there are different ways to do it, but then we as a system have to have the courage to try different ways and figure out other ways where it can work, knowing that the system has been doing its best with the best intent, but the more we learn, particularly around the brain stuff and the wiring, and if something's just firing and wiring the same way, that nothing's changing. So
Yeah.
if we don't change the way we do things, we could just be compounding someone's traumatic experience and then blaming them for not changing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's easy to say that it's their fault and they're the one with the problem, whereas the reality is if the environment's not supporting them to have a safe experience, then that childhood trauma is going to come out in various ways.
And in some cases it could be as simple, I mean it's not always simple, but it could be as simple as simply, you know, an explanatory sentence to someone about what's happening. This is the procedure, this is a protocol, I'm going to take you to such and such. Whereas for the traumatised person, everything's happening to them and they feel totally powerless.
Yes, and I think communication is absolutely critical, that we all need to understand what's happening to us. So if someone is hypervigilant and you give them another shock, there's going to be a reaction as a result.
So we've been talking about how a re-traumatising experience could be an overt one, like seclusion and restraint would be obvious examples, but they can also be less obvious, and even with the best intention, a clinician could be echoing something from somebody's past and not be aware of it. And that could be simply in the inherent power differential, where you've got a clinician and you've got a consumer accessing a service. I think the key thing for us is noticing if somebody's state shifts, because that gives us information that something's going on for them, like if they become dysregulated, if they become shut down, or if they become very hyper aroused. That's information to us that something's happened. I don't necessarily need to know what has triggered them or what has happened, but something is not okay for them, and I can attend to that, and that might minimise the risk of the re-traumatisation.
Absolutely. And, you know, people with mental health conditions, there's a lot of stigma still about it in society. There's a lot of responses in certain ways where people are... Yeah, so in society there's lots of challenges for people who have a mental health condition, not least of which is the stigma that surrounds the conditions itself. And often the challenge with complex trauma is there's been an imbalance in the power with the person who was the abuser or the person who was the primary caregiver, where that person as a child has had an adverse experience. And so when they go to get support in an organisation or a system that has an inherent power differential, then that alone can be triggering and can make a big impact on people.
And the mental health experience itself can be traumatising. Like to having an episode, having a psychotic episode, having things that you're not in control of within your own system can in and of itself be highly destabilising and frightening.
So all the more reason why we need
Absolutely.
to take these trauma-informed steps to minimise the possibility of compounding the original trauma, of making things worse. And we can all learn to do that. They're often simple steps of de-escalation.
Yeah, yeah.
A subtle example that I learnt in my own practice as a psychotherapist, instead of, you know, gesturing someone into a room and sort of gesturing towards the seat, like take a seat, it was even stepping back from that and saying, sit where you like.
Yeah.
Because one is I control the space and the other one is I'm inviting them into that space.
You have a choice.
So that example sums up several of the trauma-informed principles:
Yeah.
collaborative, safety, empowerment.
Yeah, the height of the chair, whether you're sitting behind a computer, whether you're taking notes immediately, whether you actually connect with the person first before you actually engage in the process you're trying to deliver. They all become really important aspects.
They're all ways to minimise re-traumatisation.
Yeah.